Memory is a skill that can be practiced, learned, and mastered. By using the right method, remembering even abstract things like tones and pronunciation in Mandarin becomes possible, even easy. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about using mnemonics for learning abstract things such as pronunciation and tones in Mandarin. Mnemonics are clever memory techniques you can use to remember anything, and in this episode then we're going to look at how you can apply mnemonics to things like tones and pronunciation as a student of Mandarin. This will then allow you to recall, say, what tone a character has, or if it's supposed to be Z or ZH in a specific word. It's worth noting that learning how to hear and say the tones, for example, is different from remembering which tone it is. And in this episode then we're talking about remembering things, but if you're interested in learning tones, both to say and to hear them, you can check out the Hacking Chinese Guide to Mandarin Tones, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Before we start talking about using mnemonics to remember tones and pronunciation, I want to highlight that this should not be your main method for remembering and learning these things. Instead, you should try to immerse yourself in as much Chinese as possible, and if we're talking about tones and pronunciation, this usually means listening. If you listen a lot to varied content at a level that you can deal with, you will hear words used in different contexts over and over, repeatedly over a long period of time, and that will allow you to build up a feel for how words are supposed to sound. You might be able to feel this for very common words, even if you haven't studied Chinese for a very long time. For example, if I say 老师 instead of 老师 for teacher, you might just hear that something sounded off with the first one, not necessarily thinking that that wasn't a low tone followed by a high tone as it should, but just that something felt off because you probably heard the word 老师 so many times that if I say something completely different, it just sounds weird. The only way to build this kind of feel for what the language is supposed to sound like is to listen a lot. So if you're not doing that, forget about mnemonics, just start by listening more, and most of the sounds and tones will come naturally. Now, this doesn't mean that you will automatically and easily learn all the sounds and tones for any words that you encounter, but it does mean that it will work for most cases. And what we're going to talk about in this episode then is what you learn when this doesn't work, or potentially when you really need to make sure you remember the tone of a character. Maybe you have an exam coming up and this happens to be important. Then it's a great idea to employ mnemonics to make sure you remember. I also want to mention that there is an older article on Hacking Chinese covering how to learn abstract things in general, so not specifically pronunciation and tones, as we're going to talk about today, but for example, abstract character components or other things you might want to memorize. That article is called How to Create Mnemonics for General or Abstract Character Components. It hasn't made it to the podcast yet, but I'll put a link in the show notes. So mnemonics usually work by associating something you want to learn with something you already know in a memorable way, or possibly linking things together in a memorable way. Just to mention one example, if you want to learn how to write the character for mother in Chinese, ma, you can imagine your mother, who's a woman, being ridden by a horse. This is rather bizarre. People usually ride horses, not the other way around, so it's rather easy to remember. Most memory techniques rely on things being associated with each other in an unusual way because our brains tend to pick that up. And so by deliberately making the association as bizarre as possible, we essentially tell our brains that something interesting is going on here, and it becomes trivial to remember it later. If you've never tried using memory techniques, you can try it next time you go shopping. Instead of writing down all the things that you need to buy, you simply connect them together in a long string of bizarre associations. It might not work perfectly the first time, but I've conducted several experiments with students to see how well this works, even if you don't practice that much. And if you're given a list of, say, 15 random nouns to memorize, most people can remember around 7 of them without using any kind of technique. But after being taught the basics of mnemonics over just a 10-minute period, most people can remember almost all the 15 nouns they were asked to memorize. That's all good and well, but it's not that easy to apply to something like tones or maybe initials or finals in Mandarin. After all, it's easy to visualize or create a bizarre link between two concrete nouns, but it's rather hard to do so between something like ZH or the third tone, because they are abstract by nature and therefore harder to picture or to associate with each other in a kind of meaningful or bizarre way. This is where we need to introduce something called pegging, which can be seen as a kind of infrastructure for your memory. In essence, it means taking something abstract, such as tones, and connecting them to something concrete. And then when you want to memorize the abstract things, you use the concrete things instead and link these together. And because you know how these abstract things are linked to the concrete things, you can then also use mnemonics as normal to memorize abstract things. If you found that confusing, don't worry, we'll look at a concrete example here to show you what I mean. Let's say you want to memorize a string of digits, such as a phone number or maybe your credit card number. Well, these numbers are abstract. You can't really visualize a 2 or an 8, so it's hard to connect 2 and 8 in a meaningful way that allows you to remember this when needed. So what you do here is that you create pegs, i.e. something concrete that can represent each number, and then you use these concrete things when you create mnemonics. A very simple system here could be to use people to represent the numbers. So 1 might be Neo from the Matrix, 2 might be Tupac, and 3 might be the Three Musketeers, or something like that. Then if your credit card number starts with 1, 2, 3, well, you only need to connect Neo to Tupac and then to the Three Musketeers. And this is rather easy to do in a memorable way. Like I said, this is a kind of infrastructure for your memory, so it takes some time to establish this system. For example, you need to remember which person was linked to which number, which can be made a lot easier if the concrete thing you use as a stand-in for the abstract thing is also linked to that abstract thing. In my example, Neo is of course the 1, and the Tupac has, well, the pronunciation of the number 2 in the name, and the Three Musketeers are 3, and so on. It's important that you scale and adjust your pegging system to the task you're going to use it for. If your goal is to memorize a 4-digit PIN code, for example, the system I just described with Neo, Tupac, and the Three Musketeers is probably enough because you don't have that many numbers. But if you actually would like to memorize your credit card number or maybe even longer numbers, you do need a slightly more sophisticated system. The reason is quite simply that if you have 16 digits to memorize, you need to connect 16 people with each other in a long chain, and this is very cumbersome and takes a lot of time. One way to develop this system further is to use one peg for every number between 1 and 100, not just between 1 and 10. This would allow you to memorize a 16-digit number in just 8 associations rather than 16. I developed such a system almost 20 years ago, and I still use it when I need to remember numbers. For example, to remember a standard Swedish phone number, I only need 5 pictures. So if I were to memorize my own phone number using this system, it would be Cole, Jackal, Tarzan, Sun. And I'm not going to go through exactly how this works here, because this is supposed to be about learning Chinese and not memorizing numbers, but there is a connection between the numbers and the syllables. More specifically, I use a certain sound for each number. So for example, 0 is S or Z, and 1 is T or D, so Tarzan is 1, 0. This means that even if I were to forget a specific image I'm using, I can always come up with something on the fly if I need to. Now that we know what pegs are and how we can use them to memorize abstract things, let's see how we can use this to learn pronunciation and tones in Mandarin. So I'm going to use tones as an example, but like I said, you could use a similar system for anything you want. And what we're going to do then is to use one concrete representation of each tone. Even though you can connect tones to colors in many different ways, I learned using one system, which is probably the most common one, and there the first tone is red, the second tone is yellow, the third tone is green, and the fourth tone is blue. This almost works as a pegging system in itself, but colors are a little bit too abstract, so I've taken it one step further and converted each color to an element. This gives us first tone, red, fire, second tone, yellow, light, third tone, green, vegetation, and fourth tone, blue, water. So if I wanted to remember the tone combination 3 plus 1, such as in 老师, that would be using the combination of vegetation and fire. This is normally not how I would use this system to remember tones, however. Instead, I would take this element, so for example water or fire, and incorporate it into the mnemonic I already have for the character, or the one I create if I need to. So we talked about a mnemonic for the character ma, meaning mother, earlier, and can you recall the association we made there? Well, it was your mother being ridden by a horse. Now, I imagine that most students don't need a mnemonic for this character, so I'm just bringing it up as an example. You're usually using this for characters where you often forget the tone, or for rare characters where you for some reason need to remember the tone, even though they are infrequently used. So what you do is that you simply set the whole scene on fire. So you have your mother being ridden by a horse in a burning inferno. Fire is linked to red, which is linked to the first tone, and when you see the flames, you will know that it's a first tone. I strongly encourage you to come up with your own pegging system, and I think the colors here might be a good example. If you don't have this natural connection between color and tone that I just mentioned, or even worse, if you have a different mapping than the one I just described, then using this system that I described is terrible, so come up with your own instead. I'm not going to go through the entire system I use to memorize initials and finals in Mandarin when I need to, because there are some 60 different images and it would simply take too long. And like I said, it's not something you should use anyway, you should come up with your own. A general method that works well though is to associate each initial and final with a specific character and the meaning of that character. So for example, you could use zi, san, to represent the initial z. And you can use a spider, 蜘蛛, to represent the initial zh, zh. Then, as before, you incorporate this element into the mnemonic for a character if you need to remember what the initial is and what the final is. However, I think it's important to point out that you shouldn't do this for every single character. You will spend way too much time on creating and remembering mnemonics rather than engaging with the Chinese language more directly. Most initials and finals you will probably remember without relying on mnemonics. Remember, I said that initially, that if you immerse in the language, most things will just come to you naturally and you don't need to use these fancy memory techniques. This is something I discussed recently on the podcast, so check out episode 229, Don't Use Mnemonics for Everything When Learning Chinese. Before wrapping up this episode, I'd like to say a few words about avoiding interference. If you've tried using mnemonics in a way similar to the one I described, you might have noticed that it's sometimes easy to mix things up. For example, if you picture your mother being ridden by a horse in a burning inferno, how do you know that that fire is not supposed to be the character component for fire and not the tone? Well, if you don't create mnemonics systematically, this could be an issue sometimes, although I think in most cases you will remember which is which without really trying to. If you experience problems with interference, there are two ways of getting around it that I think work pretty well for Chinese characters and pronunciation and tones. The first one is to let pegs representing different kinds of information serve different roles in the story or image that you're creating. For example, in my system for tones, I always use the tone information in the background. This is why I said that I pictured my mother being ridden by a horse in a burning inferno, not that the horse was on fire or that there was a fireplace or something else. No, the whole scene is on fire, it's a background element. Similarly, when something is the fourth tone, I just don't imagine a glass of water or water being in the scene somehow. I imagine everything taking place underwater. This ensures that if I do want to use the character components fire and water, and these are rather common after all, I can include these without mixing them up with the tones. You could also, for example, always use people for initials and then use animals for the finals or something else. The other option, which is less reliable in my opinion, is to use the order of the elements to determine what's what. So for example, you always make sure that you mention the tone last. Maybe this works better if you're the storytelling kind of person, but if you're just imagining a scene, there might not be a clear first and last, and so this method might not work as well. Okay, so there you have it. This is a method for memorizing tones and pronunciation that almost always works if you have the pegging system in place. And when it comes to tones at least, the pegging system can be very simple. You literally just need to use 4 elements. As I've said, this is not something that I recommend that you use all the time, but if you keep forgetting what the tone is of a specific character or how to say something, and you get frustrated because of this, the method we've talked about in this episode will make sure you never forget it again. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.